All right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a Wild and Woolly concert this evening. This is a concert I've been particularly looking forward to because I get to mention a name in a lecture, a pre-concert lecture at the Carmel Bach Festival that I never thought I would have the pleasure of naming, and I'll tell you that in a while and why it is a pleasure. My name is David Gordon, and I've been with the festival for a long time, and I love standing here and talking with you about the music. Since we started last year with Thursday nights being a little bit unusual, we bookend it with Baroque music, and what comes in between is things that connect the musics together. And that's what's going to happen, and I'm going to talk to you tonight a little bit more about the instruments than about the music, because the artists will be talking about the music from the stage. They're two delightful people, and I'll tell you a little bit about them as we go along. First of all, I have some housekeeping announcements to make. First of all, thanks to Access Monterey Peninsula for live streaming these lectures on the internet and archiving them on their website. This is channel 27. I was just asked if it is on DirecTV. Is there anybody up there in the studio who can tell me if channel 27 is on DirecTV? No. Okay. You're on the internet. Okay. We really thank AMP. AMP is a community media organization that serves all of Monterey County, and they provide television broadcast and production services to public organizations and educational institutions and government entities, and it's a wonderful community and volunteer operation, and we are very, very glad for their partnership because it helps us to get the events in this room out to more people and for a long period of time. I'm also happy to remind you about our new tradition. It's now in its fourth year, which is our Art of Music art raffle in the upper patio in the Marjorie Evans Gallery. It'll be open through the end of the day on July the 28th, and tickets will be available until that time. Buy a raffle ticket and you might get to win one of the 125 artworks that are on display up there. It's a very colorful and wonderful display. This display is a work of art itself. I also want to give kudos again to my friend Joan Hughes, who was partner with my wife Ginna in producing that incredible big 5x7 quilted banner that hangs over the entrance to the upper lobby. It's an evocation of the festival program book. My wife Ginna conceived the project and started the piecing of, if you're quilters, you know what I'm talking about, pieced it, and Joan Hughes quilted it, and my wife, as she said, put the bling on it. The glitz. It was a wonderful partnership, and I can't tell you how much I enjoyed seeing that project come together. This is a banner year for the festival. We are surrounded by banners. My wife has restored a lot of the banners that were made for the mission concerts over the years by Nancy Morrow, a dear friend of mine who passed away just a couple of years ago. And we're bringing that back to help celebrate the 75th anniversary. Thank you for your part in that wonderful big 75th banner. It'd be much too exciting to sleep under it. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to hear a concert tonight that is, as our Thursday night concerts are destined to be, a little out of the ordinary. And I'm really amused by it. I heard these performers last March in Santa Cruz. I went up there to meet them because I knew we were going to have them here. They're two delightful people. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the instruments that they are playing because we've never featured this instrument in a main concert at the Carmel Bach Festival. Deep in ancient grottos in France, cave paintings have been discovered, 10,000 years older or more. And in one of these caves, there is a figure of a man with what appears to be a musical instrument. And that musical instrument is formed by stretching a sinew or a tendon of an animal from one end of a stick to another so the stick is bowed much like an archery bow. It's perhaps the earliest illustration of a musical instrument, and it is a plucked musical instrument. The string would have been plucked with the fingers or hit with a stick. And increase in volume in Aboriginal music making is made by putting one end of the stick against your lower teeth and using your jaw and your mouth as a resonator. That can get old pretty quickly. And so attempts were made early on to create resonators that would attach to one end of the stick. Gourds were a common thing that would act as something that would resonate and reinforce the sound. More sophisticated stringed instruments begin to appear in artwork about 2000 BC in Mesopotamia. And we see that by that time they have an instrument that actually has a fingerboard. This is something that you press the string down on, and by making it shorter, by pressing it down somewhere on its length, it changes the pitch. The strings were sometimes plucked with a hard object known as a plectrum rather than fingers, because a plectrum or pick produces a louder, sharper sound than the fingertips. By the 7th century, there was a folk lute called the oud. The oud remains in use today, particularly in Armenia and Egypt. Oud is the Arabic name for wood. An oud is a kind of wooden lute. The oud found its way into Spain during the Moorish conquest of Spain, roughly 1,000 years ago. It also made its way to Venice through coastal trading. It also came to Europe with the returning Crusaders around 1099. There's a painting by the 14th century artist Agnello Gaddi that depicts an angel playing a miniature lute, which was called a mandora. The Assyrians called this relatively new instrument the pantura. The Arabs called it the dambura. The Spaniards called it the mandora. The Italians called it a mandola. And a small version of the mandola, about this long, was called a mandolina. And from that we derived the name mandolin. As the popularity of this instrument increased in the 17th and 18th centuries, Baroque composers began to write music for it. Vivaldi wrote 5 concertos for the mandolin, and tonight's concert opens with one of those concertos, his concerto for 2 mandolins in G major. Now, all mandolins, regardless of shape or size or national origin, and I'll show you how we're going to see 2 different types of mandolins on the stage tonight, but all mandolins, regardless of shape or size or nationality, share one distinctive trait. They are strung in what are known as double string courses. A course is a pair of strings that are very close together, tuned either in unison or 1 octave apart, and they are played by both fingers as though they are 1 string, but it's really 2 strings very close together. The double strings add sonority. Because it is mathematically impossible to tune them exactly to the same note, they create a certain timbre, because the 2 notes are very, very microscopically slightly apart in pitch. The double strings add volume and tonal character. The biggest and most egregious example of the double string instrument is the 12-string guitar, which is a big, loud, noisy thing. Most mandolins have 4 courses. That is, they have 4 pairs of strings. Since there are 4 courses on each mandolin, I was going to call this lecture an 8-course concert, but we thought you might expect there would be food here, so I let that go. They have 4 courses, and they are tuned, the small mandolins we're hearing tonight are tuned exactly like a violin. G, D, A, E. It's one of the things that makes violin concertos so ideal for transcription to mandolin. Mandolins come in several forms, and we're going to see those forms tonight. Katharina Lichtenberg plays a modern replica. It's a German replica that's based on a Neapolitan mandolin. It's a little bit larger. It's designed for use in large concert halls, but it is based on the Neapolitan style known as a round back or bowl back mandolin. It has a vaulted back made of tapered pieces of wood forming a bowl similar to a lute. In the States, we sometimes derisively refer to these as potato back mandolins. This is the traditional European mandolin. But things changed about 100 years ago in North America. The mandolin was brought into the mainstream of popular American culture by immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe. It first came into vogue in the United States in the 1850s. when it shared the parlor with zithers and parlor guitars and ukuleles and other instruments that were marketed to amuse the increasingly leisured middle class in the United States. There was a particularly marked increase in Italian immigration in the 1880s, which sparked a new wave of popularity in the bowl-backed Neapolitan mandolin. The mandolin was one of the first instruments to be recorded by Edison on a wax cylinder. By the turn of the century, mandolin ensembles were touring the vaudeville circuits. Mandolin orchestras were forming in schools and colleges. You could buy a mandolin from the Sears Roebuck catalog or the Montgomery Ward catalog, and mandolins proliferated throughout the United States. Banjo, mandolin, and guitar clubs had become the rage among middle-class youth on college campuses in the early 20th century and in towns and cities, especially in the South. And a variety of playing styles were made widely available in instruction books and recordings. Now, I mentioned the traditional Italian bowl-backed mandolin that Caterina is playing. And one man can be credited with developing the alternative mandolin universe that produced the instrument that her husband Mike Marshall is playing tonight. Same strings, same tuning, same playing technique. Aside from the different ways that you hold the instruments, they could exchange instruments and still play. The instruments' bodies are shaped differently. For this, we have to thank Orville Gibson. Gibson is a very big name in American guitar manufacture in this country. He was born in 1856 in New York. He moved to Kalamazoo, Michigan, where he set up a shop and began producing plucked stringed instruments in the 1880s. His early instruments were highly experimental and quite ornate. And in his mandolins, he departed very radically from the traditional bowl-back design brought to America by Italian immigrants. Instead of having a flat top and a rounded back, Orville Gibson's new mandolin design was based entirely on the principles of violin construction, and it used a carved maple top with F-holes in it like a violin and a carved maple back. Though this design was subtly modified over the years by different manufacturers, this set the standard for mandolin makers in North America over the past 130 years. The design represented a huge step forward in the development of the modern mandolin. The new design featured more sturdy construction, enabling a higher string tension, and this produced a full, resonant, well-balanced tone with great carrying power. In 1922, Gibson's new acoustic engineer, Lloyd Loar, refurbished the entire line of Gibson mandolins. The new versions had a number of distinguishing characteristics, including an adjustable truss rod so the neck could be adjusted when it got dry and curved a little bit, a new kind of ebony bridge, all sorts of technical features on the instrument. And perhaps Loar's greatest achievement in his 8 years with Gibson, they fired him because in 1928 he invented an electric viola, and they literally thought he had lost his mind. He was just way ahead of his time. But perhaps in the 20s, when Loar was working for Gibson, his greatest achievement was his design for the Gibson F5 model mandolin. During his half a dozen years with Gibson, during the half a dozen years that they produced this model before he left Gibson, there were approximately 170 F5s built, signed inside on the label and dated by Lloyd Loar himself. Gibson continued to produce the F5 after Lloyd Loar left the shop and is still one of their most popular instruments. Mike Marshall is playing tonight on stage one of those 170 Lloyd Loars. It's like saying he's playing a Stradivarius. It's an old, you should see the instrument close up. It's been around the block about 100 times. It's all beat up and scratched, and it's worth a very large fortune. These are the great instruments made under the auspices of a great maker by a great shop in Kalamazoo. In addition, Mike Marshall is playing tonight a mandocello, which looks just like his little mandolin, but it's the size of a guitar, and it's tuned to the pitches of the cello strings. All the mandolins on stage that I've mentioned so far tonight have metal strings. Katerina will use one other instrument tonight, a replica of an early Baroque mandolin, and that instrument has nylon strings. And they will mention these instruments as they go through the concert. I play mandolin, and I've played 2 Lloyd Loar F5s over the last 40 years, and I just didn't want to wash my hands for days after I played those things. It was an amazing experience. If you show me a Stradivarius, I'm not going to touch it because I don't play violin. I'll just make it sound horrible. But to hold one of these legendary instruments, like the one that Mike has, they're quite remarkable, and they're a real important piece of American musical history. So I've talked about the man who recreated the mandolin for North American players. Now let me tell you about the man who revolutionized the way American players play the instrument. Here's where I have a confession to make. I like to surprise people by telling them that the first musical engagement that Johann Sebastian Bach had after getting out of school when he was 17 was playing the violin in the Weimar Orchestra. People think he was an organist, and they're surprised by that. My first professional musical experiences before I had ever sung Bach or taken voice lessons was playing bluegrass banjo. And so when somebody comes who has any connection to bluegrass, I'm interested. And I'm doubly interested if there's a connection to Bach and Vivaldi. Then I have the whole thing. As the popularity of mandolin orchestras and the mandolin as a parlor instrument in the United States began to wane, it began to take somewhat of a back seat to the other instruments. In old-time country music in the 30s and 40s, the mandolin was often present, but it was generally used as a kind of accompanying instrument, almost a rhythm instrument, just playing along with the ensemble, but not as a lead instrument. And all that changed with the emergence of Bill Monroe and the Monroe brothers. William Smith Monroe was born in 1911 in Rosine, Kentucky. He was the youngest of 8 children. His mother and her brother were musicians. His mother was pianist in the church, and his uncle Pendleton Vandiver, his uncle Penn, was disabled, and he earned money as he could by playing for hoedowns and fiddles and parties. Monroe and his family grew up playing and singing music at home. Because his older brothers Birch and Charlie had already claimed the fiddle and the guitar, and another brother had claimed the banjo, or the banger, as they say down there, Bill Monroe was resigned to playing the less desirable mandolin. His mother died when he was 10, followed by his father 6 years later. After bouncing among uncles and aunts, he went to live with his Uncle Penn. And Uncle Penn took the boy along to all the hoedowns and all the square dances and all the parties. And Uncle Penn gave Bill Monroe a sense of rhythm and a repertoire of tunes. Monroe was also influenced at an early age by Charles Schultz, who was an itinerant black blues player who would pass through that part of Kentucky every once in a while. As a young man, Bill went on the road with his brother Charlie. Mandolin and guitar, vocal duos, a brother duet. There was lots of them back in those days, 2 brothers singing together. But in contrast to the sweet, relaxed, Venetian gondola, tremolo style of mandolin playing that was so common at the time, Bill played in a fiery, rapid style that brought a power and urgency to the music that simply had not been there before ever. Monroe fused his 2 childhood influences, his Uncle Penn, the fiddler, and Arnold Schultz, the blues man. Uncle Penn's fiddle playing style became an intricate part of Monroe's mandolin playing. And through the influence of Arnold Schultz, the blues man, Monroe spiced his playing with blue notes and blues turns. And the fusion of these influences created a unique and unmistakable style that has influenced every American mandolin player since the early 1950s. As radio swept the country in the 40s, Monroe's new style of mandolin playing was getting a lot of attention on the airwaves. People responded to the raw emotion of his playing. And the Monroe brothers became the most popular of all the brother acts in that era. And when Charlie died, that's when history changed. When Charlie died, Monroe went on in the 40s to form a band. Mandolin as a lead instrument, 5-string banjo, fiddle, guitar, and bass. This was at a time when the electric guitar was becoming popular in country music and rock and roll. Monroe refused to plug in. He didn't want any part of amplification or electrification of his instruments. He created a new, high-energy American folk music. In honor of his native Kentucky, he called the band the Bluegrass Boys. And that name ultimately came to refer to an entire genre of music that he basically invented. Mike Marshall will play a very brief medley of Bill Monroe tunes tonight. This is not a concert about Bill Monroe, but it's a concert about an instrument that Bill Monroe was very instrumental in changing the direction of here in the United States. This bluegrass music and this style of playing the mandolin, which is more important, the style of playing the mandolin was invented by this man. And so tonight's concert encompasses the old and the new. We start with a Vivaldi concerto that I'll tell you about in a moment. We have Bach. We have some other Baroque and 18th century composers, Jean-Marie Leclerc and Domenico Gaudioso. And then we have some 20th century music written for these people, and we have some music that they wrote. And when you hear the music that Mike Marshall wrote, it will remind you of the music that Bill Monroe wrote, except that you're hearing it with string quartet, double bass, and harpsichord. It's an amazing mix of music. And what I love about these people is that they make music and they have so much fun. They're two very sweet people. So tonight's concert, as I said, encompasses the old and the new, the traditional and the modern, and that's exactly what we want in our Thursday night concerts at the Carmel Bach Festival. The Italian mandolin and the American mandolin. The last time I saw Caterina, she was pregnant, but I didn't know it. And tonight, she said, I've been playing this mandolin so long that I'm starting to look like the mandolin. She's so sweet. One instrument, her instrument, has existed in its current form since the 17th or 18th century. The other instrument, played by her husband Mike, is an American invention of the 20th century. And as I said earlier, both instruments are played the same, tuned the same, and they both more or less sound the same. The European instrument has a slightly more gentle and sweet tone, and the American instrument has a fuller and more penetrating sound. They will speak to you from the stage, and they'll tell you about the instruments, and they'll tell you about the music they're playing as they go along. But I'll tell you about the very first piece on the concert, since they can't. Vivaldi is one of my favorite composers to talk about. He was an almost exact contemporary of Bach. He was a great violinist, performer, and he pioneered the solo concerto. Until Vivaldi's time, the Baroque concerto was a concerto grosso, a concerto of smaller group and a larger group. And when the larger group plays, the smaller group plays along. Vivaldi was a major virtuoso on the violin, and he wrote concerto after concerto after concerto for 1, 2, 3, and 4 violins. And he developed this concerto. He made it famous and was known as the Red Priest. He had taken religious orders early on. He had flaming red hair, and he cut quite a figure. He was the sort of the Franz Liszt of the 18th century violin movement. He wrote most of his music, including probably this piece, for the students at one of the schools for girls that grew up in Venice in particular. It is said that some of the students who were boarded at the school were the illegitimate daughters of nobility in Venice. And so there was a lot of money at the school, and it was essentially a musical arts academy. There were a number of such schools, ospedale, in Italy. And he wrote this music for them. He was very, very popular. His output probably exceeded the ability of the public to receive it. And at one point, about 3/4 of the way through his life, he began to fall out of popularity. People were moving on, and he was not. Nearing the end of his life and not knowing it, he realized he had been to Vienna one time and had an interaction with the emperor there, and he thought he would journey to Vienna and get a second start. And he did so. Soon after he got to Vienna, the emperor died. He had sold much of his music to finance the trip to Vienna, so he had no music to distribute and perform. He had no money. He had no patronage. He died penniless and was buried in an unmarked grave in Vienna. His music was essentially lost, and what we know about Vivaldi we know from our research into Johann Sebastian Bach, because Bach transcribed quite a number of Vivaldi pieces. And then, in the late 1930s, one of those classic moments, someone literally discovered a trunk full of Vivaldi's music. The concertos, the Gloria, operas. Another opera was just discovered about 2 weeks ago. His music had been lost, and then it was found. There was a huge music festival in 1939 in Europe to unveil all this music that no one had heard since Vivaldi had been alive. And from that box, we have almost all of the Vivaldi repertoire that we know today. Imagine if the box had never been found. The concerto that begins tonight's concert was written for two instruments like Katerina is playing. But it doesn't matter that Mike is playing an instrument that looks different, because it actually is the same instrument. They're tuned to the same notes. They have the same size of fingerboard. It's almost like playing a violin, only you have double strings, and you have frets across the fingerboard like a guitar. A real violin, of course, has fretless fingerboard. This has frets like a guitar. It's also amazing to think of how the fingers fly on this little tiny instrument. And these two people tonight are so world class. They're fun to watch, much less listen to. This is another one of our ear and mind and heart-stretching concerts, and it's just plain fun. There's classical music, 20th century contemporary music, some original pieces by the composers, and one little piece, one little medley of tunes by the man whose name I never thought I would say in this room, Bill Monroe. Thank you all so much. I'll see you up there. May I say one more thing? Just to prove to you that I wasn't joking about the banjo. Yodelay.